remember to record it this time. So welcome. We are going to be taking notes on a lesson from Canvas 6.02, the cell theory lesson. And we're also going to talk about an upcoming lab that we're going to do on Cinco de Mayo, May 5th. We're going to be doing a rocket lab. So we're going to talk about what we need to know for that, and we're going to review variables. And you guys are lucky because I'm not reviewing variables with anyone else. So we'll start by looking at this PowerPoint that I made. All right. So in this session, we are going to define the 7 characteristics of life. We're going to define the cell theory. We're going to compare and contrast unicellular and multicellular organisms. And then we're going to review variables and identify them for our rocket lab. So make sure you have like paper and a pen to take notes, or if you're going to type notes, make sure you're ready to do that. I'm going to be doing a lot of pausing and letting you write stuff down and then explaining it. Even if you've already done this lesson, which I think 2 or 3 of you guys may have already done this one, have your notes out and be ready to add to them or elaborate on them. And then the nice thing is, when you're done with this virtual session, you should be able to go take the quiz for 6.02. So I'm trying to save you guys some time here. All right, so cell theory, right? We used to not even know what cells were. In fact, there's this British scientist named Robert Hooke. He was the first person to call cells a cell. And what he was doing was he took a piece of cork, right? So cork, you might think of it like a bulletin board has cork usually, or like a wine cork, right? If you've ever seen one of those and felt it, it's kind of like spongy wood. It feels kind of weird, right? Well, he thought, oh, why don't we look at cork under the microscope? Because he just wanted to see what it looked like. So these are 2 pictures. The one on the left is a little blurrier, but that's probably more like what he saw because microscopes back then were definitely not very good. But he saw these little boxes in the microscope and he thought that they looked like cells, right? And he wasn't thinking like living cells because he didn't even know what that was yet. He was thinking like jail cells. He was like, oh, this looks like a prison where you would put people in a cell by themselves. So he called these things cells. Now I'm going to ask you guys kind of a challenging question. Is cork a living thing?
Yes.
Yes? Why? Who said yes? Was that you, Ian?
Yes.
Why? How do we know? How would we know it's living?
Because it, has cells.
Well, it has cells. That's definitely one sign, right? And you're right, it is living. Usually by the time it's in the stage where we see it, it's no longer living, right? So these cells are actually they're the cell wall of the cork because it comes from a plant, right? It's like a tree. And so the cell wall stays and we can see it forever, right? But the actual cell is no longer living because it's dried out. So he was only really able to see the cell wall. And it's actually, when we look at cells in the microscope now, we really only see the cell wall and the nucleus sometimes. That's it, right? We need a very special microscope to be able to see everything else that's inside a cell. So what is a cell, right? The basic definition of a cell is that it's the smallest unit of life. So then that begs the question, well, what is life? What makes something living? So I want you guys to tell me what you think. What are all the things that make something living?
Yeah, it's the ability to convert things like food and other products.
Okay, so nutrition, right, of some kind. They can eat something or they can use the sun. That's definitely one thing. What else? Think about all the stuff that you're doing right now that is helping you be a living thing.
Our brains.
Breathes, right? breathing or some kind of, we can say gas exchange, right? Because maybe not all organisms need the same exact gases, but we need some kind of breathing, okay? What else?
Our mind and our brain.
Yeah, and what about it?
Well, if we didn't have it, we wouldn't really know anything.
Well, that's true. I guess we wouldn't know that we were living, right? But think about it. Plants are living. They don't have a brain.
Well,
Or do they?
they technically
Water?
have a brain in the form of a nucleus.
Yeah, so plants do, they actually have a nervous system, plants. But they're not conscious like we are, right? So they're not sitting there thinking, I'm a plant, I'm photosynthesizing. But they are able to feel and respond to things. So one of the things is respond to stimuli, right? And a stimuli or a stimulus just means something in the environment. So for example, if you're walking and you see a pillar in front of you, you move out of the way, right? Or you hit it. Plants will actually rotate themselves to face the sun. So you may notice that too. If you have plants in your house, they grow towards the window or towards the sun, right? That's them responding to stimuli. They're like, oh, light's over here. Well, this is the way we're going to grow. And if you turn them, then they'll start growing towards the sun still, right? It's pretty cool. So responding to stimuli is kind of what our brain helps us do. And in other organisms, their nervous system helps them.
And that's
Okay,
also
what
how
else?
carnivorous plants operate.
I want to get one more on here. Let's think about
Adaptability.
adaptive, maybe. I was going to say, think about how much you have grown, right? You're able to grow. So you started off as a tiny little baby, and now you're the size you are, and eventually you're going to be your adult size. And even as an adult, you're still growing, right? You're still having your skin grow. You're still building neurological connections in your brain as you learn. So you're still growing. Okay, so we'll look now at the official definition of what makes something living. I like that there's a Pikachu, yeah, that's a Pikachu, right? Okay, I was gonna say, am I getting my Pokemons wrong? I like there's a Pikachu on the screen here. So there are 7 properties of life that scientists for the most part agree on. You guys said a lot of these. These are maybe different words than you may have used, but homeostasis, right? That means all living things can balance their internal conditions. So that would be breathing. That would be for us, our body temperature. We have the same temperature, right? Your body has to work all day to keep the same temperature. Sometimes you're sweating, sometimes you're shivering, right? So that you can keep that temperature. Organization, right? Living things are organized. We have a place where the brain is. We have nerves that go out and connect to the rest of the body. Uh-oh, your laptop is dying. That's not good. All right, you can watch the recording when it's done. By the way, you should be writing these things down, Pikachu. I should see Pikachu with a pen. You don't have to write the definition necessarily, but you should definitely know what the 7 properties of life are. Homeostasis, organization, okay, metabolism, right? Living things can break down other chemicals for energy. Ian said this one with nutrition, like I said, nutrition or being able to eat, right? That's part of your metabolism. Growth, right? We can use energy to grow. Rocks can't do that, right? Rocks don't grow or metabolize, although they are kind of organized, but still. Adaptation, someone said that towards the end of our conversation before, right? We change in response to our environment. Humans are super good at this, right? If it's raining, for example, we bring an umbrella. That's an example of adapting, right? If you're a fox or a bear or something like that, you might adapt to roads or buildings being built sort of in your area. You're probably not going to go near them. Response to stimuli, right? We respond to our environment. If we touch something hot, we move away from it, right? If there's something in our way, we go around it. And like I said, plants will grow towards the sun. And also, you might have even seen this. Sometimes plants grow around stuff, right? If there's something in the way and a tree is growing, the tree will just grow around it. It's pretty cool. And then the last thing is reproduction, right? All living things have the ability to make new organisms. And there's different kinds of reproduction. You guys probably are familiar with them, possibly, right? Asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. So either making a copy of yourself or producing a new organism.
My most favorite way is peat moss or sphagnum.
And how does that reproduce?
It reproduces by building its I guess it's reproductive hive, I guess,
Uh-huh.
full of air before the cap ruptures out, and all the spores fly out.
Yeah, so it basically just like explodes spores everywhere.
Yeah, like a cap gun.
Yeah, pretty intense. Yeah, there's some weird reproduction stuff going on, especially in protist plants, fungi, right? Mushrooms have spores a lot of times as well. But yeah, so these are the 7 properties of life. So any living thing that you can think of, you should be able to say that they can do all of these things, right? For example, I think one of the most interesting animals is the sponge. Did you guys know sponges are living things?
Only certain sponges.
Well, there are synthetic sponges, right? So if you have one of those sponges that you clean your dishes with that's green and yellow, and it has like the scrubby side and the soft side, right? That's not a living sponge. But in the ocean, there's tons and tons of living sponges. And they literally just attach to a rock and sit there. And then as the water moves through the sponge, they're able to do all of these properties of life.
So what is SpongeBob supposed to be?
So SpongeBob is actually interesting because he is kind of like a pun, right? He's a living fake sponge because sponges don't really look like that. But sponges are living things. Now, SpongeBob is much more intelligent, I would say, than any other sponges in the ocean because he can move around. Most sponges are anchored to a rock, right? And they don't think, and they respond to stimuli, but not in the same way, right? So SpongeBob is kind of like, I think, a humorous take on a sponge. At least I would say that. So
It's
this
more
brings us
like a
to,
human sponge.
yeah, this brings us to the cell theory, right? And we might recall from earlier in the year, theory, right, is something that scientists, for the most part, really believe and support. No one has been able to disprove it, but we don't necessarily have, we can't exactly observe it. And we'll talk about why that's true in a second. We can for some of these things. We'll talk about why it's a cell theory and not a cell law. So all living organisms are made of cells. Okay, that is something we can observe. If you take any organism and we look at it under a microscope, it will have cells. One cell possibly, or millions of cells, right? You have millions of cells in your body.
Even zombies and like undead things have cells.
Exactly, right? And that's the thing. When cells die, they don't just disappear, right? So you're right, even dead things can have cells. All cells come from other cells. Now, this is the one that's harder to, I would say, prove, because we can see that now, right? Your skin, all your skin cells come from other skin cells, right? When organisms divide, they come from other organisms. But then that brings the question, where did the first cell come from? Right? If all cells come from other cells, where did that start?
That's pretty much just asking how we managed to start life or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So that goes into a whole other question and world here, which is like, well, where do living things even come from? And by the way, scientists have like 9 theories about that as well, right? Which we won't get into in this lesson. But all cells come from other cells. Well, we can see that now, but we don't know where the first cell came from. Okay. And then cells are the basic unit of life. We also can prove that and we can see that, right? We can go back to our 7 properties of life, and cells can do all 7 of these things. They can grow, they can adapt, they can metabolize, they're organized, they balance their internal conditions, they respond to stimuli, and they can reproduce, right? So cells do all of that stuff. So these 3 things make up the cell theory, right? And because of that, all cells come from other cells thing, it's a theory. But no one's been able to disprove that. So we take it as fact. It also brings up an interesting point here, unicellular versus multicellular organisms, right? We said all organisms are made of cells. Well, all living organisms. So unicellular, uni means one, right? That prefix. So unicellular organisms have 1 cell. That's it. An example would be a bacteria, right? Here's a picture of a bacteria, and it's actually funny because it's like right next to Ian. It looks like the same size as Ian. But it's really, really tiny, right? You can't see bacteria. In fact, there's bacteria all over you right now, but it's probably harmless, right? Then we have multicellular organisms. There's more than 1 cell. An example would be plants and animals, right? Plants have tons of cells. You have tons of cells. Both types of organisms still follow the cell theory, right? They're made of cells, either one or many. Their cells came from other cells, right? Your cells came from your parents. A bacteria is a copy of its parent, right? So all cells are coming from other cells. And then that a cell is the basic unit of life. Well, these unicellular organisms, bacteria, and multicellular organisms, us, we both have the 7 characteristics of life, right? So bacteria even are able to do all 7 of those things, even though we like to think of them as simple, lesser than organisms, right? But they can still do all that stuff. They can reproduce, they can metabolize, they're organized, etc. So make sure you know the difference between these 2 words, right? I like to just remember that uni means 1. Like think about a unicycle. It has 1 wheel, right? And a bicycle has 2 wheels, right? There's lots of these kind of words in the English language where there's a little prefix that tells you a number of something. So in this case, unicellular, there's 1 cell. Multicellular, many. Okay. That was the whole lesson about cells. We're about to go into rockets. Do you guys have any questions or comments that you want to make about cells before we move on?
How are plants supposed to have cells? Like, are the roots the cells?
So that's a great question. They have cells everywhere. The leaf is made up of specialized cells. Like think about how your skin is a specialized cell. In plants, leaves are like a special type of cell. There are root cells. There are stem cells that compose the stem. And they're specialized, meaning that they have a purpose, right? So the leaf cells, for example, they're green because they contain a green pigment that helps them capture the sunlight.
Okay.
So yeah, so there's many different kinds of cells in plants. And you will learn later in this unit about plant cells just generally, like the characteristics they have, but they're usually square shaped. They have a cell wall, which we don't have, right? And they have a few features that we don't necessarily have in our cells, but they are pretty similar. That's a great question. Any other questions?
But yeah, that's why the cell wall made out of cellulose is actually why like compared to us, we're flexible and like movable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, most trees are pretty much rigid
Mm-hmm.
because of the cell wall.
Exactly, right? And there's a different process too in plants to make that like tree trunk, right? Think about how strong and thick a tree trunk is. You have to have special tools to cut those things down, right? And it's actually, crazily enough, it's made of sugar, right? The cell wall is made of sugar, but it's put together in such a way that it's incredibly strong. It's same thing with like insects, right? Like think about if you've ever stepped on like a roach or one of those like water bug things and they make that crunch sound. Their exoskeleton, the outside of them, is made of sugar as well.
So yeah, those parts are made out of cellulose, and yet a sausage casing, which is kind of flexible in that, is also made out of cellulose.
Exactly. Right? So it all depends on how the molecules are arranged. So pretty.
That's also how plastic in like Ziploc bags is so like movable,
Uh-huh.
whereas plastic in a milk carton isn't as powerful or isn't as
Flexible.
oh,
Yeah. No, it's true. That's actually a really good analogy to think about different plastics and how they're put together differently. Makes them like plastic wrap you can basically move around. And then if you tried to wrap your food in a milk jug, that would not work, right? That's a good analogy, Ian. All right, so this rocket lab. I'm really excited about this lab, guys. You should get excited about it too. I'm gonna share. I'm actually gonna post this link for you guys. Oh, won't let me copy it. What's going on here? In the chat so that you can see it.
I always wanted to make a rocket.
Well, now's your opportunity. So we're not going to be making like fuel rockets necessarily, right? There's some reading in the background, which we'll do together as a class.
we're gonna make like the ones that I used to make at my scouts.
Yeah, so I bought these like super party pack rocket kits or something. That's what they were called. And it's basically like a pretty thick plastic tube. Like think about a really thick straw. It's kind of like a thick straw. And the end of the nose has like this cushy like red thing on it so that when it hits something, it won't break. And it doesn't have any wings yet. We're going to be doing the wings. So the way we're going to launch these rockets is we're going to use air. So I got like a air pump, sort of like that you use to pump up a bicycle tire or something. It's going to shoot the rockets through the air. You guys are going to get to pick from 2 different questions, which I'm showing you right here. You're going to be able to pick if you want to do how does the number of wings affect the distance a rocket flies, or you can do how does the shape of wings affect the distance a rocket flies. So for number of wings, you could pick all types of things. You could pick like to do 1 wing, 3 wings, 5 wings. You could do 3 wings, 7 wings, 30 wings, right? Whatever you want to do. And you might even be thinking in your mind right now, like what rockets usually look like, right? Usually they have 3 wings, but is that really the best thing? We don't know. Or do we? I don't know. We'll find out in this lab. You could also do the shape of the wings. You could do triangular wings, square wings, circular wings.
Or panel wings.
Panel, yeah, exactly. Right? So there's going to be, those are the 2 question choices. What we're going to do right now is we're going to develop the variables for both questions. So if you write this down.
Here's another question. How does the size of wings affect the distance a rocket flies?
That's a great question too. And in fact, if you want to do that, that's fine with me. But let's talk about variables. So we don't know which question we're going to do yet. Maybe you're still thinking, or maybe you already know. But we want to identify our independent variable, our dependent variable, and our control variables. So our independent variable is what we are changing as the scientist. So let's look at the first question. How does the number of wings affect the distance a rocket flies? What are we changing as a scientist if we're talking about question 1?
Quantity of wings.
Yeah, the number of wings. So IV stands for independent variable. We are changing the number of wings. What are we going to measure in our rockets? How will we know if the wings matter? What are we going to measure?
The distance.
The distance, right? And in fact, everybody's going to have the same exact dependent variable. So if you do one of these 2 questions, or even if you did Ian's question about the size of the wings, right? We're all measuring the distance. And we're going to do distance like horizontally, not up in the air, right? Because we're not going to be able to measure how high it goes. We want to measure how far it goes. And then control variables, what kinds of things are we going to need to keep the same? If we're doing number of wings, what do we have to keep the same?
Maybe the size of the rocket?
Size of rocket, probably size of wings too, right? Because we just want to change the number. We don't want them to be smaller suddenly. What else?
I'm just gonna let everyone else pick because I've already stolen 2.
I would say material, right? We're not going to make some of the wings out of fabric and some of them out of paper, right? We're going to make them out of the same thing. The control variables are going to become much more obvious when you actually physically build the rockets, because you're going to be designing your wings and putting them on there. But you want to make sure your size of your rocket's the same, size of the wings is the same, and that the material you're using is the same, right? And for the most part, you want to do same placement, right? You don't want to have some of your wings on the top of the rocket and some on the bottom and some in the middle. You want to try to keep them in the same area. Okay, so that was for the first question. What if we now do the second question instead? Completely gone. Now we're doing question 2. What is our independent variable going to be for question 2 if we're doing how does the shape of wings affect the distance a rocket flies?
Wing shape.
Wing shape, right? And again, you're going to have to describe that. What shapes are you going to use? Are you going to do heart-shaped wings? Are you going to do triangle wings? That's up to you.
Yeah.
And then we already talked about our dependent variable is going to stay the same. We're still measuring our distance. And then what about for this one? What kind of control variables are we going to need?
Is that distace?
Is that what?
Is that distace? So
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I spelled distance wrong. Oops. There we go. All right, control variables. What are we going to keep the same?
more of the same.
More of the same? You mean the same kinds of stuff? Same material? Right? Same placement?
Same as the control variables during the number of wings.
Yeah, it's pretty much going to be the same, except in this case, we want to also keep the number of wings the same, right? Because if we're going to do square wings, we don't want to do 10 square wings, but we only put 2 triangle wings. We're going to have to keep the number the same.
Yeah, I'm going to stop stealing answers.
It's okay. All right, well, that's actually the end of this virtual session, guys. I wanted us to review the variables. I hope you can come on May 5th so that you can build the rockets. And there's going to be prizes that you can take home, which will be awesome. And otherwise, I'm going to end this session. There's no exit ticket. It was just you being here with me today. And I'm going to upload the recording of this. So everybody have a great afternoon. Bye.
Okay.